I'm Robert O'Sullivan, and I'm here to interview a deacon at St. Timothy's Episcopal Church in Brookings, Oregon. This church has become, I'm not sure if the word notorious is a term that's used with churches very often, but it's become very well known in Oregon and throughout the country, and we've even had communications from places like New Zealand and South Africa and Great Britain of people who face some of the same things that St. Timothy's has faced. Before going into great detail, I wonder if you could talk a little about your understanding of what the term deacon means and its roots and its background and a little about what you do in that capacity.
Yes. Well, I'm an ordained minister in the Episcopal Church. And in the Episcopal Church, we have 3 ordained clergy people. We have the bishop, and we have a priest whose duties are sacramental and as the leader of a congregation. And the deacon is considered the bridge from the congregation, the people in the church, to the world, with the intent of the deacon keeping the church informed as to the needs of the world and helping and mentoring people to go out into the world and help.
Historically, the structure of priest and deacon and bishop developed pretty early. And can you tell a little about what you know of that and what functions deacons in the early church usually played?
Well, the very, very first early church, the apostles were involved with choosing individuals to help the poor so that the elders at the time, presbyters at the time, the apostles at the time could be teaching the gospel. And so deacons were brought into the church very, very early. St. Philip is one of them, and there were Phoebe, a woman, very soon after. And so, although the diaconate hasn't continued, nonstop since that time, the Episcopal Church attempts to go back to the early church for its understanding of who deacons are called to be.
And St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr, was a deacon as well. And I think that it's symbolically really important to realize that the church back then had the duty to share the gospel, to try to get converts and all that, but at the same time, they recognized that the teachings of Jesus were not all about the other world, about what happens after you die, but was about this world as much. And many of the things that Jesus had to say, most notably in the last part of Matthew 25, is that the this worldly things of responding to the needs of the naked and the poor and the hungry and the stranger at the gate and all of those was at the heart of what Jesus was teaching in his ministry.
Exactly.
Do you want to comment about that?
Well, I think that is just beautiful theology and important for all Christians to remember. We make an enormous effort to, as we say, follow Jesus and listen to what is said in the Gospels. All of Scripture is important, but certainly the 4 Gospels teach us exactly Jesus' words and what we are to do, and much of that is in caring and loving one another in all ways. The stranger, hence the immigrant, those needing housing, those needing food, those needing companionship, and those just needing someone to be with.
All Christian churches, I hope I can say this, probably in one way or another do respond to those things, but they're not necessarily seeing that response as at the heart of their ministry. And I wonder if you might talk a little personally, because I understand that you, like many members of St. Tim's, was not originally part of the Episcopal faith, and yet you were part of the Roman Catholic faith and involved in works that had to do with how the Catholics, through specifically one organization for which you worked for a long time, tried to meet those needs. Could you just talk a little autobiographically about what you did in that capacity? And
yes, well, I was raised in the Episcopal Church and confirmed, and as a young adult in my 20s, did work with the church and started an outreach committee in my church, of which there was none. And so that was sort of the beginning, because my sense has always been listening to the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus. And so that was the beginning. But I did spend my middle years, about 18, in the Roman Catholic Church, of which I immediately got very busy with St. Vincent de Paul Society, which was an international organization as a lay organization, not started by the church per se, but as a lay organization in France in the late 1800s. And so it's very active all over the United States. And mostly we think of it as the thrift shop, St. Vincent de Paul thrift shops, which are everywhere. But, and I did not know this, but they actually are an organization that has teams of people, 2 by 2, going to people's homes when asked for. It's not proselytizing, it's not teaching the gospel, it's when people call to say they're they need help. Food, medical, something wrong with their car, they can't get to work, all kinds of things. And each conference that's set up locally all over the regions responds. And so I got involved with that because I always feel that that's what we should be doing, along with, worship and prayer, helping those in need. So I got very, very, very involved with that.
And you were often involved in those visiting teams?
Yes, I was. Yes, and so this is in Marin County, north of San Francisco, which is a very affluent county, but it has several pockets of deep, deep poverty. And we were working in one of those particular neighborhoods, and they counted on St. Vincent de Paul. And essentially for the entire county, regardless of how many churches, St. Vincent de Paul was the boots on the ground.
That's interesting because it's a lay organization, and within Catholicism, if dioceses and archbishops and all those are involved, usually they're in control.
Yeah.
But that's interesting to learn that when it came to the type of things that St. Vincent's was involved in,
right,
was not really controlled in the same way that
no,
abbeys and
convents and all.
Convents.
That's an interesting thought. You, the parish priest has to invite the society to be a part of the congregation, but that's about the only control that the church itself has. And
they usually are happy to do that, I assume.
Yes. Yes.
What other type of duties have you developed as a deacon here in Brookings?
Well, with coming here, even when my bishop was starting to talk about it, when I was not even ordained yet, but under his advisement, he said, well, Father Bernie has a heart of a deacon. They don't really need a deacon.
That's interesting.
But this was where I was landing, and although I was in denial for a very long time during my formal discernment, was God calling me to do this? This is where I landed, and this is where I would be and wouldn't be able to move. So that knowledge about my circumstances was known as I started to move forward and wait for about a year through this formal process to see if the church was going to call me forward to start a seminary-like program for 3 years of academics.
The word discernment is not used too often among people, and it's used somewhat more among Episcopalians and Catholics than any other Christians that I'm aware of. But there's kind of two aspects to it, I believe. One, the personal discernment, that personal understanding of one's gifts and one's abilities and one's calling. As Lutherans would be more likely to talk in those terms. But there's also a formal discernment, and you got involved in that. And what did that involve?
Well, unlike choosing any type of career and understanding what education you might need, and perhaps getting a license, taking tests before you can move into that career, for ordination, for a priest or a deacon, there has to be a call seen in you by the church. So even if you feel like, well, I think God's calling me, in my case, I didn't think God was calling me, except then I'm obedient and I kept doing the next step because other people saw a call. You still have to go through a very formal process, even psychological testing and lots of interviews and writings for the church itself, first locally here at St. Tim's, for our leaders here to say, yes, we see a call, or no, we don't. And if they do and agree, then they write the bishop, and then the bishop at the higher level, the state level, diocesan level of a church, starts to do the same sort of thing, only a little bit more detailed. So it's about a year-long process before the church decides, yes, this person should now start the educational process. It doesn't mean they'll become a deacon, just start the next process.
Things like this are somewhat common in several denominations in different forms. I know the Presbyterians have ministerial students who are under care of presbytery, I think they call it. And there's some continuing communication going on while they're in seminary and so forth. But in some denominations, people just go to school or and maybe have an internship, but they're kind of trained in an academic sort of way, but they're not necessarily facing those life questions in the same way you've been talking about, and I think they suffer because of that. Would you agree?
Well, I think, I don't know about them individually, but I think the people that they relate to, their congregation, could potentially suffer because there's a really strong method of looking for problems that individual might have, underlying personality traits, all kinds of things, to try to understand before the church calls that person forward to, potentially be a leader in caring for people individually.
And if that's a well-designed and disciplined process, it probably saves a lot of issues further on of people who might think they have a calling but don't necessarily have it in one that most Christians would want it to be understood.
Well, it certainly is important. It certainly helps. But, once you are really ordained and set at a church and start to get involved, certainly things can arise where, there could be problems. But at least it's a good start.
As my understanding of your understanding of being a deacon, it doesn't always just involve the nitty-gritty stuff about personal needs and finances and that, but goes far beyond that in terms of your interaction with people and with the community.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it takes all kinds of different forms. So at St. Timothy's, we have a lot of people working on issues and caring for people's needs. We call it the advocacy team. And we're also partnering with a lot of nonprofits in the region that do the similar things. But what I try to do, because I have that capacity and not being in an employed situation, I can do sometimes the more intimate, more personal, ongoing companioning of someone, maybe is for several years regarding what's going on in their life. So I have a number of individuals I'm working with that I do that with, someone who's gone through lengthy, years-long cancer treatment, who would need companioning to help to get to appointments or all kinds of things. And there's another situation with a mother and son that have ongoing things. So I have that ability to just companion, as we call it. And then as a deacon, I'm also really involved at St. Timothy's with Christian education. So we have lots of new people at St. Timothy's. The church has attracted new people because they see that we are really trying to follow Jesus. And so we've had lots of new energy come into the church, and they're interested to learn more about the Episcopal Church and learn more about our worship and our prayer life. And so I've had an opportunity over the last 3 years to do a number of different classes.
You also seem to sometimes appear at community forums. I think I first met you at an Indivisible group here in Brookings, and you see that as part of your calling?
Yes, certainly attracted to any groups that are working on social justice issues. And, you know, as clergy, both Father Bernie and I, over the years, have been at city council meetings to see what's going on. If we know there's an issue on the agenda that impacts our people in need in particular. Yes.
You mentioned something about being unpaid. Is that typical of Episcopal deacons?
Deacons are considered to be non-stipendiary, which is a very lovely, fancy word for essentially
money in the wallet,
volunteering your time and energy.
Non-stipendiary.
Non-stipendiary. And so that's helpful for parishes, especially who are on really tight budgets. And small parishes, that's certainly helpful in that sense. But it comes more from the deacons are servants, considered servants. That began in the very early church. And so it goes along with that serving mode.
Yeah. In your capacity with Christian education here, you actually helped my education a bit by asking me to talk with the group about some of the early creeds and things that happened in the early church.
Right.
And part of what I saw in that was that the early church involved women considerably more in its first 300-400 years than ever since. Well, it's changed radically in the last 30-40 years maybe, but would you care to comment about that and your own?
Well, it does fascinate me because for those people who are interested in early church history, you learn about the Desert Fathers in Egypt who were kind of led hermetic lives, and people came out from the cities to gain spiritual learning from them. Well, there were more desert mothers during that area in the desert, along with the Desert Fathers, and of course they knew one another. But what we hear later, centuries later, about the Desert Fathers, and then St. Paul had 16 women that he used for worship space and prayer and preaching.
Thecla was one of them, or?
Yes, and I used to be able to tell you a few more names because I wrote a paper about it in my diaconal program, but I was fascinated with that. And that doesn't translate really well when you listen to or read Paul's letters to the various communities, but that was the case. And so it's just, it's always been that way. It's a patriarchal society, and it's been many, many centuries where that was the norm.
Although Paul did, in the writings that we have that are attributed to him, say some things about women keeping silent in the church and even things about clothing and that sort of thing. But he is also the one who said that in Christ there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave or free. And
exactly.
Fortunately, that insight kind of counterbalances that the kind of sexist stuff that's associated to
Right. If churches that are, choose to, certainly they can pick and choose what Paul says, and a lot of the things regarding women and regarding how they should behave or how they should appear in church are very cultural, specific issues that were going on in the church at that time, in that particular church. But like everything, we all like to cherry pick what fits our feelings.
And in the life of Jesus, of course, his mother played a very important role, but also Mary Magdalene.
Absolutely.
And we don't quite fully understand the nature of that relationship, but she was one of the first witnesses to the resurrection. And in early Christian art,
Right.
there are times when there might be a mural or something which involves all the apostles or the 12 disciples, but often the two Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Jesus, were not only in the picture, but kind of really importantly in the picture as often closest to Jesus.
Right. And then in Christian art in the 5th, 6th, 7th century, people have discovered now, because of the technology we have, that Mary Magdalene was removed from the murals. You know, there's a lot of knowledge now about the art where she was removed. So, yeah.
Well, that's interesting. This is somewhat of an artistic aside, but there's been some interesting studies of early art in Christianity. Did not have crucifixion scenes and that for like 7, 8 centuries, but many of the artworks were about paradise, that Christianity was understood as a return to paradise, and paradise is not only a beautiful place, but a place where people are all cared for and fed and enjoy beauty and enjoy art and enjoy companionship and things that were not just focused on the afterlife. But
Heaven on earth.
but the change happened, 800, 900 in the Common Era, and all of a sudden there are a lot of scenes of crucifixion, and a lot of the theology changed away from the paradisical nature of their understanding of Christianity to one that has to do with sin and guilt and eternal life in context of where you end up in that. And it really changed the whole direction, especially of Western Christianity.
It did. Yes, it did. One thing I wanted to add about deacons is that although I am retired and many of the people I know are retired, many deacons are still working. So that is actually a very ideal way for someone to choose to be a deacon who is perhaps out in the world as a nurse or a school teacher or even someone as a firefighter or EMT in caring positions out in the world, and they are also ordained to be a deacon and working in their current parish, local parish. So that's also very sort of attuned to this idea of deacons being non-stipendiary or not paid. So they're still in the world, they're still working, and they're also part of the church and bringing the church to the world.
Well, there's kind of a trend that's somewhat of a necessity of a lot of pastors and priests also being bivocational.
Right, exactly.
And they can probably learn from what's happened with deacons that way.
Right, which is, Paul was a tent maker. All of them were either fishermen or carpenters or doing other things. So, yes, we're sort of hearkening back to that a little bit.
And I've had some conversations with clergy that have shown that some who kind of went to college and then went to seminary and maybe had an internship and then went into the ministry don't necessarily involve understanding the real world very well.
Right.
That one gains from secular employment. You meet different types of people. They're not just the ones in the church.
Yeah.
You hear all sorts of things that you might never hear otherwise. And although it might be a trend that's due to economic necessity, in many ways it's a good trend.
Yeah, absolutely. Over my adulthood, I think I have known about 7 or 8 attorneys who mid-career went back to school and then seminary and decided they were called, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah. In the case of two Lutheran pastors, or retired Lutheran pastors who are now part of the St. Tim's community.
Yes.
Both of us had a wide variety of secular employment for a good half of our life virtually. And I always saw it as an advantage. I knew what it was like sitting in pews listening to sermons and how long they were and how relevant they were and all that kind of thing. And I hope that contributed to my performance later in that capacity. But ministry for Christians doesn't really necessarily involve having titles like pastor, priest, or bishop, or deacon, but an understanding that once one has experienced the love of God as we know it in Jesus, that one necessarily is trying to show love and compassion to others.
Absolutely. And we actually, in the Episcopal Church, although there are three formal orders, as we call them, bishop, priest, and deacon, we always talk about the fourth order, and that's the laity being lay people, and that's extremely important. And so most of the people that we brought into the church more formally in the last 3 years with all these classes have gone on to be marvelous leaders in this church and doing all kinds of new and different things based on their gifts that they brought to us.
Can you, this is not exactly a necessary, well, it is a deacon function, come to think of it. There's a woman who works at St. Tim's who is a Lutheran deacon.
Yes.
And a member of the Sisterhood of Deaconesses within the ELCA, I think it's called. I'm not sure if that's accurately the title. Can you tell a little about what she does here?
Yes, her background and her education, and she still is an attorney. So she was in San Francisco for about 10 years. Having grown up here, her goal was always to come back to Brookings and serve the community. So while she was in San Francisco, she was primarily doing low-income and property law with a goal to do that for a community that needed it. And so she was able finally to come back to Brookings, and through her church, because at the same time, shortly after law school, she also went to a seminary so that she could be an ordained Lutheran deacon, and combined those gifts of servanthood for those in need with her law degree. And so she came back here, and through the Lutheran Church and grants, she's able to be employed in order to help people here that wouldn't ever be able to see an attorney.
Her name is Sister Cora Rose, by the way. So. And can you get a little more, if you know it, get a little more specific of the type of things she does that help people?
Well, she has a number of office hours, that she's here at St. Tim's. She's not employed by St. Timothy's, but she has clients that come to see her. A number of things she's doing in this past 2 years is expungements. So it turns out that people who are having trouble getting housing often get stopped in their tracks because of a background check that shows some sort of felony 20, 25 years ago.
May have been about marijuana or something.
Could have been,
like that.
yes. Not, we're not talking about dangerous crimes. And so through the legal system, anyone is able to, see if they could get that expunged or removed from their record so that they could move forward in life for basic needs. And often people in those circumstances don't have the money to have an attorney and do need legal aid. And so she is able to help them in that way and has done 60 different expungements in our county, whereas before Sister Cora Rose came here, there'd been only several in the last decade. So the need is great, and she's actually helping people. And then that person can move on to get that housing or whatever it is that they, were dealing with before.
Another term within the Episcopal Church is the term chaplain. There's special training for that. In fact, someone here at St. Tim's is involved in that. Could you talk a little about what that means?
We have several people in this church who have done are in the process of doing the training for chaplaincy, and some of it are through and actually working as a chaplain. So when we all, at one point in our lives, end up going to the hospital, or a family member's at the hospital, we're all familiar with chaplains. And often churches have, or hospitals have, a small chapel on a wing of their building. And I always used to think that that was members of different denominations, perhaps a Catholic church chaplain, or Episcopal, or a Lutheran chaplain, who would be there if somebody called upon them and needed prayer, or that there would be a bit of proselytizing or talking about the faith. And it isn't that at all. A chaplain is actually to be a listener, purely. And a chaplain need not have a full faith life or a specific theology, but just is trained in how to listen to someone in crises. And so chaplaincy is a long coursework. There's a lot involved to learn how to meet someone in the midst of crisis and how to be of benefit to them. And so that's what a chaplain is there in any hospital. So a lot of care facilities, even nursing homes, might have a chaplain come in once a week. So often deacons are chaplains before they feel called to ordained life in a church.
And it both involve a fair amount of education. And
right, a fair amount of coursework for sure, and testing and certification. And so often hospitals only hire someone who's been through several levels of chaplaincy training.
Yeah, and I don't know how familiar you are with clinical pastoral education, but that's...
I'm very familiar.
Okay. Maybe you could talk a little about that.
Yes.
That kind of defines how Christians from certain denominations, anyway, get their training and understanding of chaplaincy.
Right, exactly. So in the Episcopal Church, all clergy are required to take a certain amount of units, as they call it, of CPE, Clinical Pastoral Counseling Education, CPE. And so deacons as well are expected to take a CPE course. For us, mine lasted about 9 months. And we are expected to communicate or relate with, for myself, I had to relate to 6, 7 different individuals in their own crisis situation and chaplain them or companion them through it, and then write what we call verbatims, papers, about the discussions, and share it with my colleagues. For me, the class was online, on Zoom, but there were 6 of us in different parts of the Northwest who were doing this chaplaincy, and we would gather several times a week to talk about how our work was going, what we were learning, and certainly going over books and texts we were expected to read.
And they were learning from each other as to what types of things came up.
Right, and the facilitator would grade us and encourage us to dialogue in different ways that would be more helpful.
Yeah. And it's not only necessarily just listening; it's in some ways enabling or connecting people with particular needs with people who could help them meet those needs.
Sure. We're sort of the first line of someone who may potentially need some serious counseling, but we are just there to listen and reflect back to that person what they're saying so they can hear themselves more clearly.
Now, this church has been famous, or in some people's minds infamous, because of its feeding programs and other social services. Do some of the chaplaincy, and I know that there's an understanding that with the feeding doesn't mean you have to come to a service or you have to come listen to a lecture.
No, absolutely not.
But is there a point when people who come here for feeding, who realize that these people are not all judging them as homeless and just because of their employment situation or because of the high economic things going on in the community, and that's where it's not proselytizing, it's trying to help out, isn't it?
It's just companionship, yes. And we do have Maria Sudeth, who is came and joined this church about 3 years ago, and her call, she felt, was to become a chaplain. So she's in her second series of chaplaincy courses, and she's actually here at St. Timothy's as a chaplain for anyone in need, in particular unsheltered folk. So the community meals, yes, are open to anybody. And now with food prices going up and people on fixed incomes that are not going up, there is certainly a need for, someone to come in and help with additional food source.
Her background was in education, wasn't it?
And yes, she was a professor at Chico State. So she has a marvelous education and a great compassion for the work. But it's because people come and ask her, could you just sit down with me? I'm going through a rough spot. Could you talk with me, Maria? And for those of us who, clergy that might go to a community meal, we're just there to say, how's it going?
Yeah.
We never ask,
yeah.
What's happening about that, unless we already are in relationship. So the whole goal, mostly of everybody here at St. Timothy's, is to learn to be in relationship with people who are going through a crisis so that they feel that they're being heard.
It's not necessarily crisis-oriented, but another part of the ministry here has to do with the community garden.
Yes.
Can you talk about your role in that?
Yes. So I arrived at St. Timothy's in the summer of 2016, and I was already in discernment from my parish in Sausalito, California. But I came here not to tell them that right away. I wanted to just get the lay of the land. And one of the things Father Bernie said, well, we have this flag lot next door, and there was a group of people that wanted to do a community garden, and they were able to grow food on this weed slopey space for about a year, but the goal is always to have a more organized community garden. And I understand that you have done some garden design work in your previous life, and is this something you would be interested in pursuing? So it's a long story short, but it took a couple years because then COVID struck. But we got a community garden built. We have 8 raised beds, and we, although we began with people from churches wanting to adopt a raised bed and grow food for the food bank, now those who have adopted beds, it's much more diverse. And we have a wonderful new group of team members who are raising vegetables now in 8 beds, and we harvest on Wednesdays once the produce starts coming in, and it goes for the senior market here in Brookings through the food bank.
I have one comment I've made to you and others before. The garden could use some ways to make it easy for people with mobility challenges to get around in it.
Yeah, we have a pathway, but it's bark dust, and it's always been bark dust, but it's a long, sloping U, and so, it is difficult unless people had some of the new power chairs, certainly wheelchairs, but that's the nature of it because it's terraced.
Yeah. Someone listening to this or watching this might have some extra funds that they might help make.
That would be wonderful. We could have handrails on the staircases.
Yeah,
sure.
Because it's pretty tricky if you're challenged to get around there.
Yeah.
Well, are there other things that you want to add about your ministry and?
Well, I would love to see someone that begins to sense a call from this parish to the diaconate. Mm-hmm. I'll probably be a deacon here a good 5-10 more years, but I want there always to be a deacon at St. Timothy's. And it's a long process from thinking that maybe God's calling me. It's about a 4 or 5 year process. So I'm hoping to raise up another deacon here at St. Tim's.
Were the courses involving a seminary, or is it a separate kind of
Well, it is
training?
through a seminary, but it's Seabury Bexley, which is, I believe, back in Connecticut. I could very well be wrong on that. But we are using it, the Diocese of Western Oregon is using it as an online source. Mm-hmm. So there is some coursework and some involvement with people here in the state, and some of the coursework is done online. Mm-hmm. So that makes it, easier. a difficult thing for anyone already in a community that can't uproot and go to a brick and mortar seminary. So it's good that there's online courses.
You mentioned that St. Tim's has an advocacy program.
Yes.
What's meant by that?
Well, St. Timothy's has been caring for the needs of the community for 20 plus years and more before that.
The food bank got started here.
The food bank was started in the basement down here. We have been supportive of all kinds of organizations trying to do that. The priest that was here and a mentor to Father Bernie had a mind and a heart for all of those kinds of things. And so Father Bernie, when he became the priest here, also wanted to continue that. But they were able to do it in smaller ways because they had a small staff, essentially the receptionist and secretary. But there were Pat and Claire did a lot to help people get clothing, to get their Oregon ID if they had just arrived in town and were unsheltered. And so it began in that way. And then there was an opportunity to create this advocacy team. Just a few people came with special skills that Father Bernie felt would be perfect at doing certain tasks relating to our unsheltered community. And so bit by bit, it became more formulated. We had a nurse here at St. Timothy's who started formally organizing it. When I was in my diaconate program, I had to do field ed, so I got to come to St. Timothy's, officially in my field ed as an intern and help this nurse start to form what we ended up calling the advocacy team. And then grant money was available, and we could actually hire others to do specific needs. And so Sister Cora Rose came in sort of during that time, and now it's amazing. There are, I think, 5 staff people now that work on part-time, maybe 3/4 time basis in helping our folk.
And some of it actually involves them or getting onto healthcare plans and things like that.
Absolutely, getting them signed up for Oregon Health Plan, helping them get any kind of licensure or certification. We try to get people into cars if they're literally sleeping on the ground, and there still are many people that's their circumstances. But if we can get them in a car, they have shelter. If they don't have a driver's license, we help them do that. We usually pay for 6 months of car insurance if that's what's needed, just to get people stabilized, because it's not ideal, but housing in this town is, very, very minimal. And so what we need is a great deal more for people to, as our prayer is transition into a better life.
If our listeners or viewers are not terribly aware of Brookings, it's a beautiful coastal town in southern Oregon. And like many beautiful vacation-oriented towns, it is full of a lot of housing that is not really designed for people with jobs at fast food restaurants or waitresses, or even somebody tells me that bank clerks have trouble getting housing here. And yet it's an attractive place to be, but there also are a lot of nice homes here that go empty much of the year. They're used as vacation rentals. And that's a very tricky thing because they're empty and people are trying to find housing at the same time.
Right. And of course, all communities all across the country are struggling with this. But nonetheless, St. Timothy's holds on to this dream that we pray about out loud multiple times a week, to have some type of transitional housing. And that could mean as simple as a fenced parking lot with some supervision, to a place where people can pitch a tent, to a tiny house, or a group home. There's all kinds of levels that are needed for individuals to move through, get stabilized, be able to get mental health care, and hopefully good employment. But housing has to happen before people can even imagine that. So that's our dream.
Yeah, and that housing issue is, of course, all over the country, but it's especially bad in touristy towns because of the very nature of them, and it's really it's interesting. Episcopalians are noted for long liturgies and a lot of words, and but it's interesting that here there's one prayer that's said every Sunday that has to do with finding adequate place for the homeless to survive in a better way than they are right now.
Right. There's lots of ways people are unsheltered too. And, it isn't just home ownership. People who are trying to live in their cars and make a go of it need a safe place to park, and there are no safe places to park, and the city doesn't even allow it. So we have a need for those kinds of formalized structures somewhere in town.
Although in a curious way, the question of people in cars, there was a time when the city council asked churches to allow that to happen. And
Such an irony.
There's extreme irony there, because that led eventually in many ways to all the problems about the feeding and the more outrageous thing the city was trying to do, saying that churches were only here for worship and other things should be moved out of here.
It got very complicated because the city, I think part of it from a prompting and dialogues that Father Bernie had with them, but the city came up with the idea that perhaps churches could volunteer and be given 3, 5 permits, depending on the size of their parking lot. And we probably have at St. Timothy's one of the smallest parking lots of all the many, many, many churches in this town.
But this was the only one that agreed to do that.
We were the only one that said we would do that, and so we got a permit for 3. 2 of them, one was a woman with her 3-year-old child in a little van, a little tiny van. Another man was an elder that walked with a cane, and the other was another woman. And, we had a porta potty and a water station, and obviously the support here in the church of those 3 individuals, which we all knew. And the neighborhood was not pleased with any of it, and so it started. But it was always sad to myself that churches with large parking lots that could have done the same and helped, nobody stepped forward, and then it de-escalated into all the other issues we ended up with, and they wanted to restrict us from even having community meals, which they, of course, were not able to do.
There's something that probably city officials should have known from high school, and that is that churches have to be treated differently from other pieces of land and buildings in a community. It's not just a matter of, we're in charge of these things and we can say what can and cannot be done. But the reason churches have to be treated differently has to do with the U.S. Constitution, which both has a non-establishment clause, but also a clause that says that you shouldn't be involved in the free exercise of religion. The Oregon Constitution is even clearer in the point. They add words like, for any reason whatsoever, you should not be interfering with people's right to exercise their religion. And beyond that, there's a federal law that not everyone necessarily would have learned in a high school civics class, but if you're engaged in the type of things the city government should be engaged in, it should be understood. And that federal law was passed in the year 2000. It's called the Institutionalized, the Act of Religious Freedom and Institutionalized Persons. I don't quite think I have it accurately worded there, but it's close. And it basically says that to interfere with any activities of a church, there has to be a compelling state interest that only can be achieved by what they're trying to do to the church to make it meet their needs. And that compelling state interest is a strong idea in the law. It says it's not just we think it'd be a good idea. It has to be something that is really important, but not only that, but that the only way to meet that interest is by doing something restrictive on the church's activities. Now, interestingly, this passed Congress unanimously. Now, about the only things that passed Congress unanimously is naming a bridge for a highway patrolman who died on it or something like that. But not only did it pass unanimously, in the U.S. Senate, perhaps the extremes of ideological forces all came together. The main Democratic advocate for that bill was Teddy Kennedy, perhaps the most liberal member of the Senate at the time, while the Republican advocate, chief advocate for the bill was Lauren Hatch from Utah, who was a very, very conservative Republican. And yet they agreed. They agreed that cities should stop messing around in churches for reasons that vary. I remember in my youth, I traveled around quite a bit, but a church right in the middle of downtown Los Angeles was totally destroyed through eminent domain because it was in the way of what turned out to be the heart of the freeway system being built there. And that cannot be done so easily anymore because of that law. And there are a lot of other things that clearly are not the city's business, but the local officials in Brookings did not quite understand that and wanted to give the impression that many elected officials do across the land, and that is if you're tough on those who are helping the homeless, maybe the homeless or the unhoused will move to the next town. And that's gone on all over the land, and yet it doesn't help to just try and say those people, if they only would get a job, which isn't always easy to do, or if they get a well-paying job, or if they somehow didn't have to use public bathrooms to, and it's curious, things like the ways in which St. Tim's has been helpful to people is, among other things, during its office hours, which are 3 times a week for 3 hours, people can take showers here. And some people say, we don't like those homeless people being able to do that in my neighborhood. I guess they prefer there being more smelly or something. But it's part of why this church has been attracting so many new members, why it's gotten attention throughout Oregon, especially. The Ecumenical Council of Oregon, or Ecumenical Organization of Oregon, chose to nominate both Father Lindsay and Sister Cora Rose as Humanitarians of the Year because of their willingness to not let the city run over them and say you can't do this and you can't do that. And as I myself found myself saying before City Council, that it was not in their jurisdiction, it was not in their bailiwick, and it was none of their business. And it was important that they understand that, and they should have understood that based on just plain high school civics, because the Constitution of Oregon, Constitution of the state of the United States, and that federal act I talk about all say you don't mess with churches and say that it's just like saying you can't have a welding shop in your garage. It's much different. Churches have to be treated differently, and that's an important part of the history of this country. In some states, there were those who would have made a particular church the established church of that state, just like the Church of England is an established church in the UK. And the American way of looking at civil liberty and religious liberty was to say, no, they cannot be made to be conformed with that kind of thinking. So, have you felt outside pressure from people who don't understand what St. Tim's has been doing?
Well, I'm certainly aware of the pressure of, of a variety of people who are not content with St. Tim's and what we do, but I don't really feel it individually. It's easy for me to say, well, it's about getting to know the person. Everyone has a story, and it's just horrible to lump and use the word homeless for a large group of people that are struggling for a large number of reasons. So when we first have someone come to St. Timothy's and say, could you help me with this? Could you help me with that? There's always a conversation that starts out first. And although I don't have those initial conversations very much right now.
It's the advocacy team or Father
team.
Bernie.
I did when I had my internship here, and so had a chance to do those first conversations. And it was stunning, the percentage of people who had serious, horrific child abuse stories. So it made me, look at our unsheltered community in an entirely different way, because I could look out on that population and know that a piece of the responsibility, not all of it, a piece of the responsibility was the parents and their upbringing of those kids that ended up on the streets, that often sought drugs for self-soothing. Mm-hmm. And then a percentage of those, and a percentage of those, not all of them, got seriously addicted and then became, that percentage of serious hardcore addicts that are also part of the homeless community. But it isn't everybody. And in this last 2 years, most of the people that have come that we have helped have been mothers on the streets with babies, some with newborns, and elders. And not just senior citizens, 80 and 90-year-olds.
Thank you. We've been listening to Linda Lee, deacon at St. Timothy's Episcopal Church here in Brookings, Oregon.